It's a great honor and a great pleasure to welcome on behalf of the Foundation of Skepsis to introduce to you Professor Chris French. For those of you who haven't heard of Chris French yet, I will very briefly introduce him. He is currently the Professor of Psychology and Head of Animalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths in London, and he's also the founder of the Greenwich Skeptics in the Pub. He's also the Special Advisor and former Editor-in-Chief of Skeptic magazine, the UK's foremost and longest running skeptical magazine. His two main current areas of research are animalistic psychology, that is the study of extraordinary phenomena of behavior and experience, including those which are often labeled paranormal, as we've just seen. The other area is the relationship between cognition and emotion, especially anxiety. Professor French published over 80 books, chapters, journal articles on these and other topics, including journals like The Lancet and the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology, etc. He has provided an informed skeptical perspective on a wide range of topics, including psychic predictions, all paranormal, so-called alleged paranormal phenomena like psychic prediction, telepathy, faith healing, hypnotic past life regression, ghosts, UFOs, out-of-body experiences, astrology, and so on and so on. And he did so not only for a scientific audience, but also for radio and television programs. He appeared on various science programs and other documentaries, current affair programs, in addition to numerous discussion programs. Last summer, and this is the only thing I'd like to add to this, he participated in the AMA, Ask Me Anything session that was organized last summer, and the audience at large was able to ask Professor French all kinds of things about the psychology of the paranormal. This afternoon, again, we're very honored. He will address the paranormal and how to recognize the paranormal and pseudoscience scientific expert, Professor French. Is this on? Yeah, you can hear me at the back?
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for all coming today, and it's a great honour to be asked to talk to you today. I've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm relying on the fact that your English is much better than my Dutch. I'm sure the last session was brilliant, it looked fantastic, I didn't understand a word. Never mind. Quite a lot to get through. Very brief discussion of what is science. Talk a little bit about pseudoscience in psychology and elsewhere. Scott Lilienfeld's features of pseudoscience. A few quick tips that I've put together myself for spotting a potential pseudoscientist. The psychology of pseudoscientific belief, and Ray Hyman's proper criticism, and Cook and Lewandowski's debunking handbook. So there's quite a lot to get through in 45 minutes. Let's get going. The question, what is science, and how do we distinguish between science and non-science, and specifically, how do we distinguish between science and pseudoscience, is a very, very difficult question to answer. It's known as the demarcation problem. So first of all, we have to have some attempt at trying to say what is science. Now, a kind of naive, perhaps naive view of science that some people date back to this man. I'm not saying he was naive, he's a very brilliant man. The notion of science as induction. Francis Bacon is sometimes attributed with this idea. That's what scientists do. They look around the world around them and they notice regularities. So they may, for example, notice that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. So once they've noticed a regularity, they then test it systematically. They repeat the observation. If water always boils at 100 degrees centigrade, then eventually they decide they've got a new universal law. Now the problem with this is that just because water has always boiled at 100 degrees centigrade 1 million times does not logically guarantee it will happen the next time you do it. If you happen to be on top of Everest when you do it, then the water will boil at a different temperature due to a different air pressure. So induction doesn't really stand up as a description of what science is about. in terms of trying to come up with universally true laws. Now, this man, one of my intellectual heroes, Sir Karl Popper, pointed out these problems with induction, and he proposed instead that for something to be a science, it has to be potentially falsifiable. It has to generate hypotheses, have theories, that certain observations could prove to be false. And if you can prove that they're false, that's a great step forward. Then, in the case of water boiling at 100 degrees centigrade, you'd have to come up with a different theory, one that accounted for all the prior data, all those observations where water did boil at 100 degrees centigrade, but also included the new data. It had to be a richer, more explanatory theory. And in this case, you take into account air pressure, so you generate a better theory. The point here is that falsification, according to Popper, was the main criterion for deciding whether you were dealing with a science, or a non-science, or a pseudoscience. And the scientist's job was always to try to falsify their own hypothesis. If you couldn't falsify it, then you could tentatively accept it. But there was no such thing as absolute certainty in science. And I think that's a really important notion that lots of skeptics take to heart. Popper pointed to certain areas of investigation, Freud's psychoanalysis, Marxism, as being non-sciences. Although they were often presented as sciences, and Freud and Marx believed that they were doing science, there are problems of falsifiability. There was no particular observations that could ever take place that would actually have proven these belief systems wrong. In other words, they couldn't actually make any predictions. They could only apparently account for findings retrospectively. Now, if you can't make predictions that can therefore be proved wrong, it's not really science at all. It's not really explaining anything. So, falsification then. According to Popper, this was the key criterion to decide between science and non-science. And I do, as I said, tip my hat to Sir Karl Popper. He was a great thinker, in my opinion. But there are problems with the notion of using falsification as this criterion, this kind of gold standard. First of all, it, I would say, is at best prescriptive rather than descriptive. Let me put it this way, I have never come across a single scientist who designs experiments in order to try to falsify their own theories. It's just not the way we do things. We've very much got a human bias towards verification. And when we run our experiments and the data come out in line with our predictions, we go, whippy, and we write it up and we try and get another paper published. If the data don't come out the way we were predicting, we don't go, oh, fantastic, I've falsified my own theory, what a great step forward for science. We just don't do it that way. So it's prescriptive. It maybe describes science as a collective enterprise, but not how scientists work on a day-to-day basis. Another point is that, in fact, in practice, in real life, it wouldn't make sense if scientists abandoned their hypothesis the first time an apparent falsification came along. There are lots of reasons why, when you run an experiment and the data don't come out in line with your prediction, it might not be the main primary explicit hypothesis that is incorrect. It might be any one of 100 supporting hypotheses, because every time you run an experiment, anything other than a trivially simple one, there are lots and lots of implicit assumptions. Is the measure you're using appropriate? Have you actually measured it properly? Have you taken into account all the possible factors? So again, it wouldn't make sense every time in a physics school class, a practical class, somebody comes up with the wrong value for the gravitational constant, that we think, oh well, Newton was wrong, and it doesn't work that way. Okay, so it's perfectly legitimate for other scientists who maybe support a hypothesis to point out, actually your experiment did have problems with it. That's okay, that's doing good science still. So the question then is, well, does that mean falsification is just not worth anything? Is it just rubbish as a criterion? No, I'd say no. There are two ways, at least, in which falsification is still useful when you're trying to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. The first is, if the hypothesis, the theory that you're looking at, is in principle non-falsifiable, then there's no way it can be a real science. You can quite safely categorise that as a pseudoscience. I'll give you one or two examples as we go through. But also, if you get into a situation where there's an over-reliance on ad hoc excuses to avoid falsification, so lots and lots of studies have been done that don't seem to support that particular theory. And particularly if that's in a position where there's very little direct evidence that seems to support the theory, then again, you should start thinking you may be dealing with a pseudoscience here. The problem is, of course, that there's a huge subjective element there. It depends who is making the judgment about whether or not these are ad hoc excuses, whether there are too many of them, and so on and so forth. So it then gets difficult to decide between science and pseudoscience. Now, there is no, and I'll cut a very long story very short. Philosophers of science have grappled with this demarcation problem, as it's called, for a very, very long time. And the overall consensus seems to be that there is no universally agreed definition or set of criteria to differentiate true science from non-science. Instead, what you've got is a series of benchmarks. We can look at good science. We know it when we see it. I mean, if you have certain benchmarks that are met, then the more of these benchmarks that are met, the more sure you can be that you're dealing with true science, real science. And I'm not going to go through these in any great detail. I've taken these from an extremely reliable source, Wikipedia. And as my introduction was being read out, I thought I really need to get somebody to update my Wikipedia entry, so it was a good try. This is what it says on Wikipedia, and actually they're not bad as benchmarks go. A good scientific theory should be reproducible, should make predictions that can be tested by any observer with trials extending indefinitely into the future. Should be falsifiable and testable, as I've just talked about. Should be consistent, should generate no obvious logical contradictions, being consistent with observation. Should be pertinent, should describe and explain observed phenomena. Should be correctable and dynamic, subject to modification as new observations are made. Should be integrative, robust and corrigible, subsumes previous theories as approximations and allows possible subsumption by future theories. Should be parsimonious, economical in the number of assumptions and hypothetical entities. And should always be provisional and tentative. It doesn't assert the absolute certainty of the theory. So they're the kind of benchmarks that, by and large, people would say, yeah, if you're looking at something that's a real science, it will tick a lot of those boxes. But there will be areas of investigation that certainly don't tick all those boxes that most of us would accept as being genuine sciences. And indeed, psychology itself, sometimes referred to as being a soft science, particularly once we get with the kind of hard neuroscientific approach, may well not tick all of those boxes at least 100%. But I would argue that good psychology, when psychology at its best, is a genuine science. So, as I say, we need to have some idea at least of what is a proper science before we can decide what isn't a proper science. But you get the same kind of problem. There is not, inevitably, there is not going to be a clear-cut set of criteria for deciding when something is a pseudoscience versus when it isn't. It will again be a series of benchmarks. Now, I'm going to steal shamelessly from a paper by this man, Scott Lilienfeld, another of my heroes. He wrote a very nice little paper which I'd recommend to you all in 2005, The 10 Commandments of Helping Students Distinguish Science from Pseudoscience in Psychology. Now, in fact, just to remind you, pseudoscience, in general terms, is claims and methods that are falsely presented as science. And given the theme of this conference, how to spot an expert, I thought it might be interesting to actually have, well, how do you actually spot a non-expert? Somebody who's pretending to be an expert, in particular in the scientific domain, when in fact they're practicing pseudoscience. There are benefits of teaching about pseudoscience to psychology students as to students in any other discipline for that matter. Firstly, it helps students to actually understand the true nature of science, if they can themselves distinguish between likely pseudoscience and true science. And it painlessly provides critical thinking skills. At least in psychology, I do a whole course on anomalistic psychology, or the psychology behind pseudo-scientific beliefs, paranormal beliefs. We look at paranormal, ostensibly paranormal experiences, etc., etc. That's the kind of stuff that students are very interested in anyway. So you've got a fantastic hook to actually painlessly teach them critical thinking skills that then will come in handy in other areas of life. Whether you're dealing with various political claims or even just second-hand car salesmen, you need to be able to think critically to evaluate evidence properly. Scott Lilienfeld, he says he has his 10 commandments. He does suggest, I think he's joking here, that we should inscribe these commandments on impressive stone tablets to be mounted outside of all psychology departments. And he might have a point. There is an awful lot of pseudoscience, sad to say, within psychology. As well as the good stuff, we've got an awful lot of crap. I'm only going to deal with his first commandment, but I do recommend his paper if you can get hold of it. This is a list of dubious claims from psychology on the fringes of scientific knowledge that Scott put together. Extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, channeling, out-of-body experiences. By that, I'm sure he's not doubting that people have out-of-body experiences. It's how you interpret them. Is it really evidence for some kind of separation of mind and body? Subliminal persuasion, astrology, biorhythms, truth serum, the lunacy effect, hypnotic age regression, multiple personality disorder, alien abduction reports, handwriting analysis, rebirthing therapy, and untested herbal remedies for depression. You clearly could have gone on for pages and pages and pages, but that's just a sampling. Okay, if you want to read a bit more about some of this stuff, this is a very good book. I promise I'm not on commission. 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology. It tends to be in the area of popular psychology where you get a lot of this pseudo-scientific stuff. The most famous one, of course, we only use 10% of our brains. How many times have you heard that said? The appropriate response if someone says, aha, well, maybe telepathy really does exist because, as we all know, you only use 10% of your brain. The appropriate response is, well, maybe you do. The rest of us use 100%. Other myths within popular psychology: expressing anger is usually better than holding it in. Opposites attract in interpersonal relationships. High self-esteem is necessary for psychological health. And finally, people with schizophrenia have more than one personality. All of those claims are complete nonsense, but they are widely believed. Again, have a look at the book if you want to read up on more and find out the true science with regard to those topics. Okay, so as I say, I'm only going to deal with one of Scott's commandments. This is the one where he actually says, thou shalt delineate the features that distinguish science from pseudoscience. And here we are. I'm going to go through a list and then go through it each one in a bit more detail. So the list is, if you're looking at something trying to decide whether or not it's a pseudoscience, does it have these features? A tendency to invoke hypotheses which can be thought of as escape hatches or loopholes as a means of immunizing the claims from falsification. Again, falsification is right there. It always is when you come talking about pseudoscience. An absence of self-correction and an accompanying intellectual stagnation. An emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation. A tendency to place the burden of proof on skeptics, not proponents of claims. Excessive reliance on anecdotal and testimonial evidence to substantiate claims. And goes on. Evasion of the scrutiny offered by peer review. Absence of connectivity, that is, a failure to build on existing scientific knowledge. The use of impressive sounding jargon whose primary purpose is to lend claims a facade of scientific respectability. An absence of boundary conditions, that is, a failure to specify the settings under which claims do not hold. Okay, so let's go through those in a bit more detail. When it comes to ad hoc hypotheses, again, this is a prime example of a claim which is in principle non-falsifiable. The claims of young Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists claim that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. And so they've got problems. How do they account for the fact that there is fossil evidence that suggests that the Earth is much, much, much older than that? How can they account for the fact that there is light coming from stars that we know, given that we know the speed of light, must have been travelling for millions of miles to reach the Earth? Well, the answer to that, according to the young Earth creationists, is that when God created the world, he created it with those signs of prior aging already in place. The fossils were in the rocks already. The light was already on its way from the stars. It was already in transit. Now, what this means is, it doesn't matter what evidence you produce that suggests that the Earth is much older than a few thousand years, they'd never have to accept it. They can always say, God done it. You know, it just is a non-falsifiable hypothesis, therefore it is not science, it's not a scientific claim. Basically, whenever you're dealing with any claim, we go for the simplest explanation. The principle there is known as Occam's razor, after William of Ockham. Pluritatis non est ponenda sine necessitate, or plurality should not be posited without necessity. And that literally translates as just go for the explanation that makes the fewest additional extra assumptions. And that's again a claim, a principle that is close to every skeptic's heart. The absence of self-correction. Whenever you get people claiming, for example, that astrology has remained unchanged for 2,000 years, that shows it's true. No, it doesn't. What that shows is that astrologers simply ignore all the empirical evidence that shows that astrology isn't valid. There's a huge amount of evidence that shows that. It's simply ignored by the astrologers. Similarly, with respect to homeopathy. Homeopathy has been around for centuries. It's based on completely unscientific principles that the more you dilute a substance, the stronger it becomes. But it's been around for a very long time, you can't dispute that, but without any self-correction, basically by just ignoring any evidence that counts against it. Emphasis on confirmation, again the example I've chosen here rather than refutation. The example I've chosen here, this is Hans Eysenck, Professor Hans Eysenck, at one point the most influential British psychologist living. He produced evidence at one point that suggested there might be some validity in astrology, and of course this was welcomed by the astrological community. Then he went on to show that his results were actually due to an artifact that he hadn't taken into account. And of course they were not interested in the refutation. They were not interested in the fact that he was now refuting his own previous claims. The burden of proof resting with skeptics rather than believers. No, the burden of proof always rests squarely with the person who is making the claim. Nobody else, they have to prove the claim. This is one that's particularly popular amongst ufologists and paranormal investigators claiming that there's poltergeist activity, that kind of thing. The basic principle seems to be that if the skeptic or the conventional scientist cannot account for every single case that is put before them, then they should accept that the pseudo-scientific claim is true. That is just completely unreasonable. In the same way that the police cannot solve every single crime they investigate, because sometimes the evidence just isn't there. I mean, this is a nice picture of a cloud that looks like a flying saucer. But if someone had witnessed this and thought it was a flying saucer, and didn't have a camera or anything with them, so all we had was their word for what they'd seen, the evidence would have gone by the time anybody else tried to investigate. It's not reasonable. The burden of proof always rests with the person who's making it. And that incidentally applies to skeptics as well. That's why a lot of what we do, we come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. We say, well, maybe this particular phenomenon is down to the power of suggestion, but we then carry out empirical studies to actually show that the power of suggestion really is strong enough to give people the impression that something paranormal is happening when it isn't. Anecdotal evidence, and again, complementary and alternative medicine is the kind of one of the main culprits here. You go onto any of these websites for these amazing claims in complementary and alternative medicine, and what you find is testimonial after testimonial. You don't find references to well-controlled, randomized, controlled, double-blind studies. And of course, that's what you need for all kinds of reasons before you can conclude that any kind of therapy is working over and above a placebo. Evasion of peer review. This can sometimes happen sometimes this happens even within conventional science. The example I've gone for here was the announcement back in 1989 that cold fusion had been achieved by Pons and Fleischmann. If they really had achieved that, we would have had a clean supply of energy into the foreseeable future. It would have been an amazing breakthrough. But they didn't announce this through the usual channels by submitting the paper to a journal, having it go through peer review, and then eventually being published. They had a press conference. And the reason for doing this, announcing it directly to the world in this way, was they wanted to make sure that they got the credit for this amazing breakthrough. Of course, it subsequently turned out that other people carrying out properly controlled replication attempts could not replicate the effects. And so, finally, it was dismissed as being an example of what's been referred to as pathological science. But again, an example there, this is again typical in complementary alternative medicine. Books will be published, claims will be made on websites, none of which have ever gone through a peer review process. The absence of connectivity. Does the claim fit with what we know generally in other areas of science? Again, homeopathy is a good example. Homeopathy not only doesn't fit with other areas of science, it would directly contradict other areas of science if it were true. The point is we know it isn't, but again, you have to have your claims connecting with and being congruent with other areas of science. The use of impressive jargon. Again, complementary medicine is probably the best example, but there are others as well. There's lots of use of words like energy and vibration and resonance and balance and blah, 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 blah. All words that sound very scientific and are used by scientists in a very precise way. But that's not the way they're used by New Age believers. It's much more vague and hand-waving. Absence of boundary conditions. Absence of boundary conditions can manifest itself in two different ways. One is when you get the kind of claims for miracle cure-alls, something that can cure absolutely everything. That's not the way that real medicine works, so be very, very wary. Also, a situation where it's not spelt out what the conditions would be under which your claim wouldn't hold. And I'm kind of particularly sensitive to this one because we do sometimes put time and effort into directly testing paranormal claims. We will directly test a psychic claimant. And we will agree the test conditions before we begin. We'll get them to sign something to say this is a fair test of their claim. And you can guarantee with 100% certainty that when we run them through the test, when they have failed the test, they will then decide it wasn't a fair test after all, for reasons X, Y, and Z, which all seem very arbitrary. But they didn't specify those conditions in advance. They were quite happy to sign a piece of paper saying, this is a fair test of my claim. So, though I think Lilienfeld's criteria are absolutely great, I've signed with them 100%, none of them taken on their own, or even in combination, prove that something is a pseudoscience. They should be taken as warning signs. They should cause alarm bells to start ringing. It might turn out on occasion that one or two alarm bells start ringing, but it turns out, actually, no, this is a properly scientific claim after all, once a little bit more progress has been made. But they should serve to warn you. Some of them, I thought, when I read through them, though, would be difficult for people in their everyday lives to actually evaluate properly. They'd require, you might not have the resources or the time. They'd require you to kind of maybe have a university library that you can consult, etc., etc. So I've taken a few of Scott's and I've added a few of my own, just making it kind of quicker top tips. Okay, the one that I would repeat, it was on Scott's list, excessive reliance on anecdotal and testimonial evidence to substantiate claims. Second one from Scott's list, use of impressive sounding jargon whose primary purpose is to lend claims a facade of scientific respectability. One of my particular bugbears is when people talk about if this is consistent with quantum mechanics. That really gets my goat. There's a little cartoon there, in case you can't read it. The person on the left is saying, but dogs can observe the world, which means that according to quantum mechanics, they must have souls. And the caption at the bottom there is, pro tip, you can safely ignore any sentence that includes the phrase, according to quantum mechanics. Okay? I'll throw in my Schrodinger's cat joke at this point. Schrodinger's cat walks into a bar, and it doesn't. That's the best joke in the entire talk. That's really a bit sad, isn't it? Never mind. An absence of self-correction and an accompanying intellectual stagnation. Whenever people refer to this is in line with the wisdom of the ancients, just remind them that the wisdom of the ancients said the earth was flat, okay? The wisdom of the ancients, I mean, basically the ancients were no more stupid, no wiser than we were. They had a lot of mistaken beliefs. Just because something's lasted a long time, in no way guarantees that it's true. Evasion of critical scrutiny afforded by peer review. Again, I'm repeating one of Scott's. If you can't read the caption there, this is a Larson cartoon. It says, most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as, quote, quite an improvement. And it's just about getting across the idea that to actually get scientific papers published in proper journals is actually quite a tough process. You know, referees can be very, very tough on what you've submitted. And it might actually be better to just kind of have a system like this. It might be less painless. But again, if you don't have that, if all you have are claims that are not supported by good quality scientific papers in proper peer-reviewed journals, again, this should serve as a warning sign that you're probably dealing with pseudoscience. Another one of Scott's, and this is the last one I repeat, claims that the theory or application of their theory has extremely wide applicability. And again, I've gone for complementary and alternative medicine to illustrate that, because all of these different systems tend to say they can cure pretty much everything, and that's not the way that proper medicine works. No evidence of proper training in the field in question. Did they actually buy their degree from the internet? Have they maybe done a weekend's course and then got a diploma and decided they're an expert in this field? Again, it does sadly happen a lot. It happens a lot in psychology. Properly qualified scientists issuing pronouncements outside their area of expertise. These are often kind of people who've made genuinely really great, fantastic contributions to science, but then they make pronouncements about stuff that is actually beyond their area of expertise. So that there is Fred Hoyle. He stated that a living cell was as likely to form from evolution as a Boeing 747 emerging after a tornado spinning through a junkyard. You can imagine the creationists really love that quotation. But he was talking outside his area of expertise. He was an astrophysicist. He was not in any way an evolutionary biologist. This is Brian Josephson, another example. He won his Nobel Prize for his work on superconductivity, but he has claimed that quantum mechanics can explain telepathy. You know, my view would be, let's establish that there really is such a thing as telepathy first, and then we'll try and explain it. Ask yourself the question, what's in it for the person who's making the claim? The example I've gone for here is this guy, David John Oates. He has a ridiculous theory. It's great fun, and his website is fantastic for entertainment value. He claims, his theory is called reverse speech theory. He claims that whenever you speak, or you're actually producing two messages simultaneously. One message is the one that you're consciously aware of now, if you haven't fallen to sleep, and that's the one that's being produced by my left hemisphere, according to this daft theory. Simultaneously, according to him, I am producing another message with my right hemisphere, but you could only hear that, and I am not consciously aware of the fact that it's being produced, if you were to record my speech and play it backwards. And the idea is that that backwards message always tells the truth. So he recommends, I mean, and if you go to his website, it's fantastic, because you can play these clips where he's maybe got a political speech from someone, or an interview on TV, and he's playing it backwards, and he's saying, and you can hear the hidden message really is, you know. And they're absolutely great, because it's a superb example of top-down processing. You can't typically understand what the backwards message is until you read it, and then you play it back, and you think, yeah, it does kind of sound like that, you know, but it's the expectation and it's causing it to happen. But he claims that you should use his technique if you were afraid, that the police should use it when they're interrogating suspects, or that when you're interviewing someone for a job, or that counsellors should use it. You know, and he charges kind of thousands of dollars to attend his training courses, and he sells his books and all the other stuff that goes with it. And sadly, some people take him seriously. It's complete neuro-bollocks. Sorry, that's a technical expression. And so again, but I do love his website. Do go and try it out. It's very, very entertaining. I've just left the same example up for my next tip. That's endorsement from other pseudoscientists. Like, you've got an endorsement here from Larry Dossey. If you've got an endorsement from Deepak Chopra, then forget it, you're dealing with a pseudoscientist, sure sign. Pseudoscientists love to liken themselves to Galileo. That's why they've not been taken seriously by the scientific establishment, because they're so way ahead of the scientific establishment. I think Carl Sagan said it best, another of my heroes. The fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. And the point here is that for every one valid theory that is initially laughed at by scientists, and it does happen, no doubt at all, it does happen, and is then subsequently accepted, there are 10,000 crackpot theories that are rejected. The final one, because I thought I'd go, rather than top 10, I thought I don't want to go for top 10, I'll have 11, just to annoy people. So the final one, claims that appear to be simply too good to be true. The example I've gone for here is claims from the kind of the cosmic ordering idea. I don't know if you've come across this. It's a ridiculous New Age idea that you can get whatever you want just by wishing for it hard enough. And people buy books about this stuff, and people make loads of money from selling these ridiculous ideas. Again, it's just common sense. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Okay, so they're my top tips. How am I doing for time, actually? Another 5? Are you serious? Oh, I can slow down then. Really, 5? Okay, right. Okay, I'm going to talk about the psychology of pseudoscientific beliefs very, very quickly. It's true to say that some pseudoscientific beliefs have received a lot more attention from psychologists than others. Things like belief in CAM, paranormal beliefs, recently belief in conspiracy theories. Others, like neuromythology, the 10% myth, hemisphericity, those kind of ideas, less so, historical revisionism. There are some good books, so I can talk about this in 5 minutes. Michael Sherman's Believing Brain, Bruce Hood's Super Sense, very nice book that's coming out this month by my ex-postgrad Rob Brotherson, Psychology, Belief in Conspiracy Theories. Oh, and of course I will plug my own as well, why not, I'm here. Okay, in terms of... 8! Okay then, I will talk a little more slowly. No, right, in terms of the themes, again, this is a general, very quick overview. I just kind of quite arbitrarily divided it into social factors, experiential factors, cognitive factors, and emotional/motivational factors. In terms of social factors, it's pretty clear that most of what you know about the world is not based on direct experience. It's based on what you were told by parents, your friends, not the ones on the telly, but I like that picture, your teachers, and the media. And it makes sense that you generally accept what you're told. If you had to learn everything through direct experience, the human race would have died out a very long time ago. But it does mean then that magical beliefs can be passed on, pseudoscientific beliefs can be passed on. Experiential factors. Some of these claims are based upon people's own experience. And again, CAM is a good example. When people typically try out some kind of CAM therapy and they get better, they assume that proves it works. But they don't take into account the placebo effect, the fact that you always get natural variability in diseases and illness, the body's own recuperative powers. We get better from most things on our own anyway. The standard mistake that's being made here is known as post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. It's a logical error. The only way you could know if it really worked is properly controlled, randomized, double-blind trials. Crystal power is a nice example. We did studies where sometimes it's claimed by people who believe in crystal power that you can actually feel the energy. You hold the crystal and you can feel tingling or heat or warmth. And we showed, in fact, that yes, people often do report that. When you tell them, try holding this crystal to see if you can feel these effects, they report they can hear it. They also report it if you give them a fake crystal. It doesn't matter whether it's a crystal, it's the power of suggestion. Cognitive factors. Illusory correlations play a major role. Most pseudoscientific beliefs are based on the notion that A causes B. So the MMR virus causes autism. Astrology determines your personality, the position of the stars and the planets at birth. Homeopathy can cure various ailments. The problem is when it comes to assessing this evidence, what we should really do is look at all the 4 cells here. When is A paired with B? When is not A paired with B? When is A paired with not B? And when is not A paired with not B? But pseudoscientists typically don't. They just look at when these things co-occur. How many cases can they find where a child had the MMR vaccine and then developed autism? you've got to look at all 4 cells in that matrix. And instead, again, the media will then focus on specific examples. One crying mother who's very, very upset about her poor child versus what they see as being boring epidemiological data that completely disproves the claim under question. So as the cognitive factors, we each have 2 different systems of thought. That's Daniel Kahneman, who with Amos Tversky has come up with a lot of these ideas, but they're supported by lots of other research. System 1, which we might call intuition, it's quick, it's effortless, it's based on quick and dirty rules of thumb called heuristics, it's usually right, it's emotional, and it leads us it's usually right, so it generally doesn't do a bad job. System 2 is reason, it's more rational, it's slower, it's right slightly more often. Now, why have we come to depend so much on system 1 thinking, which we have, all these loads of studies show this? In evolutionary terms, it made sense. You imagine the Stone Age man there and there's a rustling in the bushes. Is that really a saber-toothed tiger? Assume it is and get the hell out of there. You'll pass your genes on. If his next cave neighbour is a bit more slower and reflective and stands there scratching his beard, he may well not pass his genes on. To make the mistake in one direction is much more costly than to make the mistake in the other direction. So we have evolved to have brains that typically are more prone towards a type 1 error, mistakenly seeing order in chaos, rather than a type 2 error, mistakenly seeing chaos in order. So we see patterns that aren't really there in randomness. We pick up on cause and effect relationships that aren't really there in what is essentially random data. Bringing in the motivational, emotional aspect, confirmation bias. Pseudoscientific claims appeal to various desires that many of us have, to get rich quick, to tap into our psychic abilities, to stay healthy, to be convinced that death is not the end, or to gain access to hidden knowledge. Confirmation bias is the bias that we all have, skeptics included, to pay more attention to evidence that supports what we want, what we already believe, or what we want to be true, rather than stuff we don't want to be true. And in this case, a lot of the time, pseudoscientific claims have the edge because they're so attractive in various ways. Practical advice. Right, I'm going to really shoot through this. You can fortunately download Ray Hyman, another of my heroes, advice related to proper criticism. Just type proper criticism Ray Hyman into Google, you'll get the website. This is what Ray came up with on the basis of his years of being on the media and taking part in debates. If you are in this position, or even if you just want to convince a friend, be prepared. Think about the questions you're going to have to answer, have sensible replies to those questions. Clarify your objectives. Is it about trying to educate the public, our long-term goal, or is it about trying to score cheap points just to show how clever you are? The latter might be satisfying, but it might undermine the more important goal. Do your homework. Get as much information as you can on your chosen topic. Consult other people who might know more than you do. Don't go beyond the level of your competence. It's okay to say, I don't know, or we don't know. Avoid at all costs using bullshit, pretending you know stuff you don't, because you'll be caught out. Let the facts speak for themselves. Let people draw their own conclusions. They're much more likely to actually stick with that belief if they've drawn the conclusion themselves. Be precise. Don't use terms loosely, because you might otherwise be misquoted or misremembered. And use the principle of charity. Don't assume that the person opposing you is a fraud, or they're dishonest, or they're stupid. They might just be mistaken. So try and start from that point. And avoid loaded words and sensationalism. All right, I'm going to finish up. How many minutes? 3? Give us 3. Thank you. The Debunking Handbook. Again, you can download this for yourself, and it is available in Dutch. So, if you just type Debunking Handbook into Google, that's from John Cook and Stefan Lewandowski. It's only a little short pamphlet, but it's very, very interesting and useful. Points out that a lot of attempts to debunk can actually sometimes backfire and lead to people increasing their level of belief in the thing that we're trying to tell them was wrong. And that's because it's based on most of our attempts to try and debunk are based on what's called the information deficit model. We assume that simply by providing accurate information, that will wipe out the misinformation, and people will then not make that mistake again. But that often doesn't happen. If people have been exposed to misinformation, it has lingering effects. And simply presenting them with the evidence that goes against it often can backfire in various ways. And they go into these ways. There's the familiarity backfire effect. If you're trying to debunk a particular claim, it's very difficult not to mention the myth that you are trying to debunk. But there is a problem with that, insofar as by mentioning it, you're making it more familiar to people. And in some cases, it can make them more likely down the line to actually think that the myth is true. So this was shown in a study by, amongst others, Skernick et al. They gave people a flyer that debunked common myths about flu vaccines. Immediately after reading the flyer, people were able to recognise the myths as myths. Even 30 minutes later, they were sometimes remembering the myth, but they'd forgotten the mental tag that said it was a myth. So by then, they were endorsing it as being something that was true. So you have to try and find ways around this. One way to do it is actually try and debunk the myth was tricky. It can be tricky without mentioning it. It might sound simple. How on earth can you do that? How can you point out something wrong without mentioning the thing itself? There are ways that you can do it if you use a little ingenuity. Not always, but often you can. So, for example, you'll often see headlines like, "Can the therapist recover repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse?" that will then go on to point out that no, they probably can't. But what people take away from that months later when they think back to it is therapists and recovering repressed memories of sexual abuse. They've forgotten the fact that you were actually trying to debunk that claim. So instead, we use a headline like, "Therapy can produce false memories of childhood sexual abuse." And then, if they remember the headline, they're remembering the accurate main message that you were trying to give them. The overkill backfire effect. Science communicators sometimes make their message too complex to be easily understood. And a simple myth is often more cognitively attractive for people than a complex debunking. Now, we might fall into the trap, and I think I probably have in the past, of thinking that the more counter-arguments we can come up with against a myth, the more effective our debunking will be. But actually, the evidence suggests that sometimes 3 simple factual counter-arguments might be more effective than 12, because you're more likely to remember them. Okay? And so their advice on this one is KISS. So don't get too excited. What that stands for is keep it simple, stupid. Okay? Go for the kind of simple but accurately. The final and most difficult backfire effect to counter is the worldview backfire effect. I mentioned confirmation bias earlier. We all suffer from it. But if you try and debunk a claim that is actually consistent with someone's wider worldview, whether it be religious beliefs, their overall philosophy of life, or whatever else it may be, then you will find they're very, very resistant to that. There's a nice study by Bukowski, for example, in 1995, lots of others I could have given you. They had volunteers read the same fact sheet about the JFK assassination. Some of the information in there was consistent with the lone gunman hypothesis, the official explanation. Other information was more consistent with a conspiracy involving multiple people. People who read it, both sides, the believers in the conspiracy theory and the skeptics, ended up thinking that it supported their point of view. It polarised views, even though they were reading the same material. And also you found that the people who had the strongest views became most polarised. Okay? So the message here is clear. You won't convince the true believers. And I think we all know that anyway, but you won't convince those people. So probably not a good idea to waste your time trying. Try and convince the people who are less committed to the idea, the people who are undecided. They are more likely to move in your direction. Think about how you frame the issue as well. So if you were talking to right-wingers, don't talk about things like do talk about things like a carbon offset charge rather than a green tax. Because to right-wingers, the word tax is like a red rag to a bull. Okay, don't use it. Just use another phrase, even though you are really talking about tax. Now, I mean, it won't bother left-wingers, but it would bother right-wingers. Okay, final point, nearly there now. People believe in these myths because they explain things for them. And if all you do is abolish the myth, you've left a gap. And it's quite likely that in a few months the myth will slip back in there. Okay. So you need to fill that gap. If you take it away, you've got an explanatory gap, you need to fill it. You need to give them an alternative explanation. You need to get over the truth of the situation. There's nice examples of this in studies that have used mock juries, where they've had a murder trial, and it's been shown that if you take the approach of just presenting evidence that shows that the defendant is likely to be innocent, that's not as effective as doing that, but also giving them an alternative suspect. Because if you just take their theory away that he did it, well, you know you've still got a dead body that needs explaining, so who did do it? But if you say, actually, there's evidence to suggest that this person over here did it, they're much more likely to acquit. You've given them an alternative explanation. But again, you need to do that when you're talking about, let's say you were going for complementary and alternative medicine, tell people about the placebo effect, tell people about the way that we recover from lots of illnesses spontaneously anyway. Explain why the myth is wrong. And you might do that by pointing out the rhetorical devices that we use to present it. You might point out that the people making the claim had cherry-picked their data, or they'd used fake experts, or they had relied on unfalsifiable conspiracy theories. But take that claim apart and put a new one, an accurate one, in its place. And also point out what did the misinformer have to gain. Were they selling books? Were they selling some new form of therapy? Were they after increased prestige and power? What was in it for them? There's a great need for critical thinking these days. There's all sorts of really important issues that we need the public to be able to think critically about, from climate change to historical revisionism. Conspiracy theories, believing conspiracy theories is rife. Conspiracy theories are not just harmless beliefs that a lot of people, well, some of them are actually, to be fair, but sometimes they're not. In countries where there are conspiracies around kind of HIV, AIDS, literally hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. Various terrorist activities have been motivated by people who strongly held these conspiracist beliefs. And it's been shown that belief in conspiracies actually leads people to be less likely to politically engage and to vote and to take action on green issues. So these are important things. So it is important that we keep on emphasising the need for critical thinking and how to distinguish between real experts and pseudoscientists. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks for this thrilling talk. I think there are many questions, if only to give further advice how to beat down the not-so-true believer. Any questions from the audience? There's one up here in front. Wait for the mic, wait for the mic.
Smaller than he was. And that's why. So you can have a wrong explanation and you still have a good answer.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been pointed out that Columbus was actually wrong in his initial assumptions. So it shows that even when you're wrong, you can sometimes make amazing discoveries, amazing breakthroughs. You've always got to be prepared. Again, an important part of skepticism is always to be open to the possibility that you may be wrong, and you should be willing to admit it when you are.
Other questions? A bit blinded by the light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, there's one point these pseudo-scientific ideas also have in common, and they appeal to the human mind because they have some kind of striking aspect. For instance, there are people who are actually alive. It's the same fascination we have for Donald Duck, which is an animal that talks. We love that kind of thing, and that's why it sticks in our mind. What can you do to counter this fascination for the impossible?
Well, again, I think you maybe don't have to. As someone who actually finds those very ideas fascinating myself, I can be fascinated by the ideas, I can enjoy the ideas. I don't have any problem at all with the paranormal in fiction. You know, it's good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for Dickens, it's good enough for me. You can be fascinated by those ideas without actually believing in them. And I think that's the kind of important challenge, really, to get across to people that when they're watching certain kinds of TV series or films at the cinema, that, yeah, it's great fun, it's interesting, it's exciting, it's not real, and to get across that distinction between exciting fiction. What is it about certain ideas? It's a really important question, and I don't think we've really ever answered it. why do Freudian ideas have so much resonance for so many people? Why do Marxist ideas have so much resonance for so many people? Why do a lot of the kind of paranormal claims and the pseudoscientific stuff? They clearly do, and you can point to different motivational factors, but it's not the case that all pseudoscientific ideas gain such wide acceptance, but some do. What are the characteristics that make those ideas have that particular quality? It's an interesting question in itself.
There's a very famous, now famous heart surgeon that you've encountered in the Lancet. His name was Pim van Lommel. He has another idea that is very attractive to many people because it kind of is something akin to your worldview backfire effect. People believing that the souls exist after their body is deceased. So what you did is you gave it a good attempt to write a piece in the Lancet accompanying the original scientific paper on which Pim van Lommel's reputation is based. Why doesn't that work?
That's interesting. I mean, that was a kind of initial attempt, as you say. I was invited to write a commentary at very short notice. Okay, what am I going to say? I could now do a much better job. In fact, I have since done a much better job.
I know.
The basic claim here was based on near-death experiences, and Pim van Lommel and various others have made certain claims that at the very least say, well, the near-death experience, they obviously clearly believe it is evidence for the separation of mind from body. But they also say, at the very least, it's a major challenge to neuroscience as we understand it. How could people possibly have these rich experiences when, in their words, these people are brain dead? Now, if that were actually an accurate statement, there might be some truth there. But there are various people, myself included, Jason Braithwaite in Birmingham, various other commentators have pointed out that the claim is just not true as phrased. Even if it were the case that the person at the time was actually flatlining, in other words, surface EEG was totally flat, that doesn't indicate anything at all about what might be happening deeper in the brain. Surface EEG can even miss activity at other areas, so we just don't know what's happening is the actual honest statement. These are very intriguing experiences, but in no way are they this major challenge. And there's all sorts of other grounds on which that can be challenged. And I've so far not seen a single attempt to refute those counter-arguments. And I think what they're doing is playing a clever game, actually, because if they've realised that if they actually try to counter the arguments, they're bringing the attention of the counter-arguments to people. So, they're basically playing a clever game by saying, well, we'll just ignore them. The people who believe in this stuff, the people who want it to be true, they'll carry on repeating these claims. Whereas if we actually take them on head-on and try and challenge them, we're drawing them to attention. I mean, we had a nice example of that the other way around in the UK when Simon Singh was sued by the British Chiropractic Association. Because up until that point, lots and lots of people in Britain thought that chiropractic was proper medicine. They had never realised it was quackery. But by launching this libel case against Simon Singh that then went into kind of legal history when Simon kind of ultimately eventually won, that drew lots and lots of attention. And so suddenly lots of people were finding out about chiropractic, about its so-called theoretical underpinnings, and realising that it was quackery. So they really shot themselves in the foot with that one.
Yep. Which was a good case.
Which was a fantastic case.
Other people? Yeah, over there.
So, Professor French, that was a really nice talk. I have one question that in one of your earlier slides, you mentioned a lot of pseudoscience, and there was a long list of all kinds of pseudoscience, and one that particularly struck me, and it was biorhythms.
Right. Yeah.
What do you mean with that?
What I mean by that is, again, it's a good point. It's a particular. It's got a particular meaning, even though I didn't go into it in detail at the time. By biorhythms, what is not to be confused with is the true science of biological rhythms. They are established. We know that There are circadian rhythms, there are monthly rhythms, there are all kinds of biological rhythms, annual rhythms obviously, that kind of affect biological systems. We know that, that's real science. Biorhythms is a particular theory that was put forward by a friend of Sigmund Freud's, Wilhelm Fliess. And he claimed at the moment of birth, there were 3 rhythms that kicked in. And there was one for intellectual powers, one for physical powers, one for emotionality. And that, I think I've got that right, and that these 3 rhythms then kicked in and nothing then changed them for the rest of your life. And it was like a sinusoidal wave with a particular periodicity. I think it was about 27 days, 29 days and 33 days or something like that. And you may remember, some of you, back in the 80s, this version of biorhythm theory, which is complete tosh, gained lots of followers, and you could have little calculators where you could look from given your date of birth, where were your rhythms on these cycles. And basically, you know, if everything was low, if you had a day where everything was at the bottom of its cycle, just don't get out of bed. You'd have a very, very bad day, you know. And there were numerous books written, all based on cherry-picking the data, showing that, you know, the first time that so-and-so won the singles at Wimbledon, they were at the top of these cycles and so on. But of course, they just trawled the data to find the cases that fit. There have been studies done, proper studies, that have looked at whether or not there is anything in this theory. No, there isn't. But that's what biorhythms meant in that context. Okay?
Another question? Up here in front.
Thank you for your interesting talk. When in your efforts to rebuke this type of theory, have you ever encountered or seen any results that, well, made you doubt whether maybe these people might have a point, or maybe your own hypothesis is not true? How do you deal with it? Is that then something you will continue on looking at, or is it then, yeah?
No, I mean,
There's two questions.
there is, yeah. I mean, the first one really, I suppose, is it's almost, I mean, forgive me, I'm not paraphrasing you properly. Sometimes people ask the question, have you come across anything that you couldn't explain in non-paranormal terms? Is that kind of what you were getting at, or to some extent? I mean, certainly, I mean, there are people that, I mean, I take quite a minority position, going off on a tangent here. I am probably one of the few skeptics in the world who actually argues that parapsychology is a genuine science. And I'll go for the door now, Alexis. You know? But that is very much not a position taken by a lot of skeptics. I kind of went through a phase. I used to be a believer in a lot of all this stuff. Then I became a kind of, I kind of got into all the skeptical side of stuff, and it was all complete nonsense. And part of my belief at that stage in thinking that parapsychology was a pseudoscience was that all parapsychologists were basically incompetent and didn't understand probability theory or statistics or experimental design. And then I actually started to meet lots of them and realised that just wasn't true. There are various people, the late Bob Morris, for example, who was held the Kersler Chair in Parapsychology at Edinburgh University, was a very, very intelligent, very, very reasonable man. He used to welcome skeptics into his laboratory where they studied telepathy using the Ganzfeld technique, etc. And he would say, if you can find things that are wrong with the way we're doing this, please tell us and we'll tighten it up. You know, and I thought, that's a very enlightened view, you know. And I realised that quite a lot of parapsychologists, they really did understand what they were doing, and sometimes they still seem to be getting positive results. Now usually, I say usually, always, whenever I tried to replicate those findings, or my students did, we typically didn't get positive results. So that was really intriguing. What's going on? There are papers appearing in journals, parapsychology journals, that get positive results that appear to be done under reasonably stringent conditions. What's going on there? It's only recently that I've kind of got very into the whole notion of questionable research practices within science, including parapsychology and psychology and all other sciences. And it's not kind of out-and-out deliberate fraud that we would all condemn. It's just giving yourself the benefit of the doubt. You know, so when I do a parapsychology, when I test a paranormal claim, I say in advance, this is how I'm going to test it, this is how I'm going to analyse the data, and I'll see what results I get. If I'm maybe doing something that's in a non-paranormal area, I'm testing a theory that I like, I might kind of design an experiment, analyse the data, And if it doesn't come out the way I thought it would, I might try analysing the data this way, or transforming the data, or doing something else. It's not fraud, but actually you're giving yourself more bites of the cherry than you should be. And of course the parapsychologists are doing that because they do believe in what they're trying to do. I think those factors come in, which has not answered your question at all, but I hope it was interesting. Sorry, I've forgotten what the second part was actually, I apologise.
But to a great extent it was, and it was,
well,
as always, illuminating. I'm afraid we have to stop here, and we thank you so much for your time and spending that time with us here today. So thanks for that. We lopen wat uit op schema, maar we willen toch een pauze inlassen. We beginnen om 4:05 weer. En dan is er het laatste item op het programma. En dat is denk ik van niet te onderschatten waarde en belang. Het gaat namelijk precies over de rol van media in het voorzien van het brede publiek van expertoordelen. Dus graag 4:05 weer hier in de zaal.